Hello, and welcome to The Art of Play. Before we begin today's episode on game psychology and mental health, I want to give a quick trigger warning. This entire episode is going to be very in-depth about a discussion of mental health in video games, and especially at about 31 minutes in, there's a very, very brief discussion about 1 minute long about the topic of suicide and negative mental health statistics. If this is something that's not for you, please feel free to skip that section, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this episode. Thank you. We are students of The Art of Play.
And we do this show called The Art of Play.
A show for the players who ask why.
I'm Vi.
And I'm Gaia.
Hey Gaia, what are we talking about today?
So much to, I think, your excitement, Vi, today we're going to be getting into the topic of game psychology and game mental health. How can we use psychology to make better games, and how can we make games themed around psychology? Now, this is one of those topics that I think we've talked about before, really can do with having a professional on the scene, to someone to ask questions to, someone to really tell us things that we can't get into without significant training.
Yeah, somebody who understands like nuance about topics, where we can go understand in broad strokes what's going on. It helps to have somebody who understands the complexity of
especially with
topic.
How broad the topic is. Usually we talk about things like depth versus complexity, which is, one concept we can dig into for an hour, but this is going to be a big topic.
Yeah.
So I'd like to invite our guest here today, if you'd like to introduce yourself for the topic today.
Yeah, hi. Really happy to be here. My name is MacLean. I'm the Mental Health Strategist here at UNB and a lifelong gamer.
Ooh. What a solid intro. Yeah, so really the perfect person to have on to have this conversation about mental health and video games.
I found my niche.
You have.
We have found the person for that niche for today's episode.
Sure.
So before kind of getting into the topic of game psychology and mental health, I'd like to ask you, Matt, what have you done in terms of like game psychology, game mental health? What is your background in this beyond just being the mental health strategist?
I would say when those two worlds collided, it wasn't my own doing. You know, I mentioned a lifelong gamer, video games, PCs and consoles, and then tabletop games, role-playing games, board games, always, and then went to school and became a therapist, and then started working here at UNB. And then it was my sister who, this had to have been 8 or 10 years ago, and I think she saw an article somewheres that talked about using tabletop role-playing games as an intervention for people with certain kinds of mental health challenges or problems, or people on the autism spectrum. And, wouldn't that be neat if you did something like that in your job? And I hate to say that I was initially dismissive, not because I didn't think it was a good idea. I think, if anything, I thought it was too cool to actually happen.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, in my personal tabletop RPG experience, I know that that's something that a lot of people have talked about, and even in the greater community, right? Giving you the space to imagine yourself in somebody else's shoes, to work through problems in a place that doesn't have consequences for your, very real personal life, right? If it happens at the table, it can stay there, right? You can make your mistake there, and you can go back and try it again, maybe, right? If you have a benevolent DM.
A lot does rest on the DM.
Yeah.
And but I think you highlighted a really key point, is that you create this lower stakes environment for people to try stuff out.
Yeah.
And if you're someone that experiences social anxiety, you don't really get a lot of low stakes opportunities.
Yeah. Especially, I think, when you are looking forward to something and you have social anxiety, you tend to think that it's make or break up until you even after you leave the room. Whereas D&D is no, we're gonna play a game, and it's going it is meant to be fun. And then you actually sort of sneak in this other mental health piece of we get to try it
with a good DM. The goal is to have fun and to maybe learn something along the way.
Yeah. I was just also thinking about understanding your identity as a queer person. There's the capacity to experience romance within the game in a way that is really challenging outside of the game. Especially I know friends who, coming up as teens, their first girlfriends or partners of same sex were within tabletop RPGs. Yeah.
So what ended up happening was I pitched to my colleagues, why don't I try starting a therapeutic tabletop role-playing game group? and over the next couple of years, maybe ran 5 or 6 different groups. And I would say 75% of the people that came out for it were queer.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that
Yeah.
makes full sense to
Right?
me, actually.
Yeah, we used to DM for the 203 on campus.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I mean, not this year, but last year I ran games, and it is so cool. That's how I met a lot of my friends, like, after COVID, where it was like, okay, you know, we are safe enough to be playing this game, right? Even sometimes we'll go online depending on what UNB is recommending for safety, right? But all of my friendships, like, post-COVID, were from that game.
Isn't that effectively how you and I started talking, Vi?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now we run a podcast, so that checks out.
Yeah, and it totally makes sense. It's a very comfortable and safe space. But I think we should probably swing back to video games, which tends to be a little bit more of our focus.
Okay.
And maybe we can talk a little bit about what it means to kind of put yourself into an RPG. I read this book a couple of years ago that was called The Psychology of Zelda. Have you ever encountered this?
I've not encountered that one.
It's really fun. It's just a collection of like short essay type articles, which condense some big psychology ideas to the application of like specific Zelda games. Like there's one about like understanding how grief works based on, is it Majora's Mask that is very cyclical?
I
Yes.
think so.
Yes. Yeah. So they talk about Majora's Mask and like how that is an analog for grief. So like really cool and specific to Zelda, which is always going to be where I want to read. And one of the things that this one article that's called Embodying the Virtual Hero by Jonathan Eckerson, or possibly Erickson, that probably is a better pronunciation of that, talking about like projection, where video game characters act as avatars in the same way a D&D character does, where you can imagine yourself within the game. I want to talk a little bit about like problem solving, right? And just the idea of like when you throw yourself at a problem enough in a video game, sometimes you can be like, okay, that isn't working. What is going to work? And then walking away and being able to apply that in your, I'm going to put this in quotes, but like your real life.
No, absolutely. It's like, again, that same idea about creating this space that is different than the meat space, if we can use that term, the real world. But it's still, there's lots of things that cross over, and so you get to play around with identity, with ideas, with perspective in a way that you just don't get to normally.
Yeah, it's just occurred to me that it's a really good way of like increasing like your plasticity, right? Because I know people who, you know, grew up in the same town, do the same day every day, they're in, you know, that kind of job, you know, but having the ability to branch out into other things just by being like, I'm going to play a video game for a little bit is such a good reprieve from like the rigidity of sort of an everyday life.
Yeah, and flexibility and the ability to adopt different perspectives is key to mental well-being, right? We often get stuck seeing an issue just one way, especially when it involves ourselves and emotions.
Yeah.
That just only hardens that tendency. But there's this quote I really like, and it applies to reading works of fiction, but I think it applies here too, where it's like a reader lives 1,000 lives.
Yeah.
A gamer lives 1,000 lives.
Yeah, I've actually read a little bit. This article mentions, I'm afraid I don't have the direct quote here, but this article does mention that in that, you know, more than fiction lets you live within a character and understand their motivations, a video game does it on a different scale because you also control that character's like agency, right? Because you are now within the plot and making different choices. So they've done studies about like how can humans like embody avatars. So they've done stuff like, okay, we're going to take a human, give them some controls, and then in this simulation, you're an 8-legged lobster. Can you learn how to like move around? And people are like increasingly totally could, right? The more time they spent doing it, the easier it was to. And it's the same thing when you pick up a game and put it down, right? The easier it is to understand how something works. And I actually, like, I learned this as part of I was in kinesiology for like a year, but it was something we talked about where during the course of human development, you don't actually learn how to like mobilize until, you know, you're a kid and you're like learning how to walk and hold things and all of that. You don't come out of the womb like deer or horses do, like, oh, I can walk, right? You have to learn how. And part of that is that so you can sort of rewire your brain if you lose a limb to move differently.
That's amazing.
And so using that same track, you can sort of hijack it for video games and be like, okay, how can we control an avatar?
I never really thought of it that way. This, because given how plastic, adaptive the brain is, I always remember this one moment when this was in the era of LAN gaming, right? If you wanted to play some multiplayer games with your friends, you had to disassemble your computer.
Oh, good.
Right?
Okay,
with
yeah.
the giant CRT monitors and tower, and haul it over to, in this case, our friend's bedroom above the garage in his parents' house. And we must have been playing some first-person shooter for too many hours.
Yes.
And then my friend, he got up to go to the washroom. And like, if you're playing a first-person, game, you can strafe, right?
Yeah.
Hold down shift, hit left, you strafe. So that's what he did in real life to go down the hallway. He didn't like turn, his body like you would normally.
Yeah.
Oh no.
We've been playing this game for too long. He strafed
Yeah.
into the hallway.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think I've ever had that, but I've definitely experienced the like putting down a controller and then being like, oh wait, okay, hang on, I've got to go over there.
Yeah.
I just always experience the put step away from my computer. Oh, my eyes are barely functional anymore. But that's, I think, because I play Age of Empires.
Yeah, I mean, I think it actually just speaks to how immersive video games can be, and in a positive way. I think the media has taken the aggression, violence part of video games and like sort of run with it a little bit too much, like sensationalized it. Like I'm thinking about also like the satanic panic of D&D.
Oh yeah.
Right? Like just like, oh hey, my kid has a book about how to summon monsters. And it's like, no, your kid has a game about statistics and math, which also has some mechanics for summoning a monster in a game, which also has stats. Like, these are different things.
This is a slightly off topic, but it just reminds me of, I would say, one of the big changes I've noticed. Being someone born in 1981, so when we're playing D&D late 80s, through the 90s, when you did not want anyone to know.
Yeah, yeah.
And it was just like, and why? It wasn't so much the satanic panic, but it was like, it just was not cool at all.
Yeah, I heard an anecdote, which could totally be false, but about somebody, it was like the wife was telling the story, and it was like, my husband has these hunting trips with his friends that he goes off on, and he won't let me help load up the truck. And then at one point she like realizes that it's because the like Rubbermaids that he says are hunting stuff is all D&D books.
Yep.
Yeah. So they're going out and not hunting, they're going camping to play D&D for like 3 days.
Yeah. So if I can kind of take it from here.
Oh, please do.
So we kind of have an idea on like the neurology and kind of the psychology and how games have an impact here. So I kind of like to use this to transition to one of my first questions for you, Matt, on my side. So I've read a paper from a few years ago now, I think this was 2017, that found that for people who have undergone stuff like traumatic events or very serious sudden mental health events, a game like Tetris can actually help reduce PTSD or trauma symptoms in the long run. The first paper showed that within a week it helps a lot, but a second paper came out in 2020 in the Journal of Psychiatry and Neuroscience that kind of confirmed over the long run it helps maintain the impacts of therapy that people have had after a traumatic event for effectively indefinitely, based on what this paper has written. So it shows that video games can play a role in mental health. Now, trauma is one very big example, but this kind of leads into one very broad question for you.
Okay.
How can we use games that we have now for mental health more in general?
Yeah. We've established some of the ingredients, already for this, like you mentioned. If you think of the brain, which is the basis for, everything having to do with how we experience.
I'm picturing all my neurons
right?
packed real tight. Yeah.
And right. And so then at the simplest level, right, you've got a neuron which connects to another neuron and so on, right? And, as it builds up, there is a greater degree of complexity, but that idea of wires that can grow or be pruned, and add into that this idea that our brains are modular. And so you've got different bits and bobs in our brain that are responsible for different things. All information processing. This is the part of your brain gets this kind of info, has a set of rules, and then decides what to do based on those sets of rules and the information coming in.
Little assigned cubicles.
Little assigned cubicles. Yeah, our brain is an office tower with people working, and when you go to sleep, some of them get turned off, but others don't. And so in an event like trauma, where you've got a part of the brain which has some pretty, it's like a, I don't know, it's a mid-level manager in the office of the brain, but in certain situations it's given a lot more authority.
Sorry, which part of the brain is this?
Okay, well, what would, the part of the brain that it's probably, just above your middle brain,
Okay.
going back to our like emotion and fear centers, which are pretty deep, pretty old. And when it experiences a trauma, some kind of an event that is so overwhelmingly scary, threatening, painful, and it says, okay, that was so bad, we have to kind of exert now much more control over the rest of the brain to protect you, right? All the things it does in this idea of, hey, we're trying to protect you, trying to keep you adaptive. But sometimes that can work against us. And so when we're experiencing trauma and we don't give that a chance to heal, right? It's going to impact us in negative ways for a long time. And so in this paper that was mentioned around playing Tetris, I'm not familiar with it, but I could guess that gives that part of the brain, it kind of quiets it down a little bit, right? Because most of your attention is focused on the game. That's where the resources are. So that other part of your brain, the trauma brain, is like, all right, it's doing its thing, but it gets to do it in the background and quiet down eventually.
It's like how I'm gonna mix these up because I was only in kin for like a year. But it's simulating your parasympathetic system versus your sympathetic system to try to like calm down, right? It's the like, oh, I'm feeling really anxious, like I'm feeling fight or flight. I'm going to do something that actively triggers your system so that one responds.
That's it. And then the states that you are in, and this really does go to what can happen through playing video games. Example of my friend that strafes and all the other ways that it adapts is because like what you are doing, the information that you're feeding into your brain is changing it, and it's learning from it all the time.
Yeah.
It's actually interesting. The fact that I'm having this conversation with you right now, the timing is funny. I'm teaching a class this term. It's Thursday evenings. That would be tonight.
Yep.
Tonight's topic is gaming and mental health.
Oh.
Yeah,
wow.
right?
Purely topical. That's fantastic.
It worked out really well.
Yeah.
And I was looking at refreshing the lecture for it. And so, came across some studies that talked about like, okay, elderly people who were experiencing some cognitive decline, and then they got them playing Super Mario Brothers.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
and then that kind of like forestalled some of that decline. And so at a sort of a neural level, that is some of the stuff that gaming can do for us, right? Is it allow us to activate or deactivate or suppress certain parts of the brain. But the other thing that it also really can allow us to do is where we get to adopt different perspectives and see things a different way. And in that same way where you got to play the game where you're an 8-legged lobster, and after a while, you can do that.
Yeah.
And so if you imagine, we know how if you were to give someone a VR headset and have them like live in a world totally different from their own, with different abilities and perceptions, ways of experiencing the world, like that's going to start doing some pretty deep rewiring of the brain.
Yeah.
And then too, a lot of what it takes to be mentally well, either in the sense of recovering from challenges that you're already experiencing or sort of building up your resilience in the face of future challenge, is skill-based. It's education. It's learning ideas and practices.
I hadn't even thought about it like that, because like sometimes I'm just a little bit concerned about like intellectualizing emotional problems versus like actually dealing with them. So it's really interesting to hear the like, that's okay because it's a skill-based thing.
100%.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
No, it's all skills. And I have this poster in my office, which I repeatedly point to. And it's from the Adventure Time cartoon, if you're familiar. And there's this line by the dog in the show and saying, sucking at something is the first step to being sort of good at something.
Yeah.
And we know that. I think we instinctually know that about certain skill areas, like playing a musical instrument.
Yeah.
But we don't apply that to things like mental health and mental well-being.
Yeah.
But it is just as true.
That's very fair. And I think a lot of us come to understanding our own mental health through experiences and not through sort of a system of study almost, or in a video game you get tutorials on how to then you get better at those things.
Totally.
We don't get that as a regimented program.
And it's just like, if you were learning to play the piano and you've never had a lesson before, and somebody sat you down in front of the piano and said, all right, play me some Chopin. First, you're not going to know the first thing to do, and even if you gave it a go, it's not going to turn out for you.
Mm-hmm.
And so that same thing applies to learning to manage anxiety or understanding where depression comes from and how it's impacting you. And so from that idea is you do have to start people off in that sweet spot of something that, there is enough of a challenge there to active learning, but is not so challenging that you just can't get anything
that it's
out of it.
Overwhelming.
Yeah. And this is where I think gaming or different kinds of technologies really allow us to do that, because again in the real world it's much more difficult to engineer those things. So I really like group therapy.
Yeah.
And so I've for years I do this one all about emotional disorders, anxiety and depression. And usually in the first session, there'll be a point where they get very scared because I say, one thing that we're going to do is we're going to start doing exposures.
Ooh,
right?
Yeah.
Because that is actually the only way, the part of your brain that is causing you to experience panic or anxiety, around whatever thing, it doesn't listen to you just talking to it and asking it to change.
Right.
But it will learn and change through direct experience.
Yeah.
I always used to struggle greatly with speaking in front of groups.
Okay.
I would have a full blown on panic attack, out of body experience, before floating back down and being okay, I don't know what I just said. But, and then the only way that got better for me was to continue doing public speaking.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the challenging bit with that. Yeah.
But we know, and there was a researcher who may or may not still be here at UB, I'm not sure, Darren Piercy in the Department of Psychology, and they looked at using virtual reality as a tool for treating public speaking anxiety. And they found it works.
That's a great idea.
Right?
Yeah.
Because again, even though we know that's not real, our brain is so easily tricked into thinking that the sensory input we're giving it is real.
Yeah.
Which, because how does it can't tell the difference.
No, it can't. It doesn't know. Yeah. I love thinking about my brain as something that has been designed for the wrong application.
Oh, I love that.
Which is okay, so my brain is made for, and, evolution and what is true, sort of aside for gently
Sure.
for a second. Just this is built for predators. This is built for resource acquisition, right? That's what it's made for. It's made to find water, find berries, think that shadows are panthers. That's what it's made for. And I'm asking it to do computer stuff. I'm asking it to go to school every day. I'm asking it to, I don't know, to do weird things, right? If I showed my ancestor what my life is like, they would be like, what are you talking about?
What terrifying hellscape is this?
Yeah, what have you made here? You put yourself in a box and it just goes places, and then you have to park it, and and all of your food is just in the fridge, right? You have none of these skills that I have built for you are you using, except for some of them are fear-based, and those don't seem to have an application here. So just thinking of your brain as something that has to have updates to catch up to the modern world makes a lot of sense when you think about developing a program for exposure therapy.
I love this way of thinking, and I use this all the time when I'm doing mental health education or mental health literacy teaching. And I did one recently in the Faculty of Computer Science. And so I was using much the same analogy that you just were, and then someone threw out this idea of the brain's factory settings.
Yes.
Because you're right, the way that our brain was developed, the pressures that it had to deal with aren't really the ones that we have to deal with today.
Yeah.
And so our factory settings are really good at dealing with the panther on the forest path all of a sudden, right?
Yeah.
But what about the modern world where there's no shortage of things to worry or feel anxious about every moment of the day?
Yeah. Yeah, and I often think about like how concentrated human interaction can be in a modern setting. And I have no idea what, historical humans, they probably had the same anxieties that I do, but maybe not, right? Like I'm thinking about when you live in a community that is, family units and everybody, shares and works together and that sort of, understanding that that's not a perfect understanding of how the world works, but it was like, okay, I trust all of these people and, they're going to have my back if we get attacked versus like, some interpersonal relationships where I'm like, are we friends? I don't know if we're friends. Is this interaction weird? Right? There's so much small minutia that I now like track for. Whereas like,
Wow.
historical brain maybe didn't do that. Factory setting brain maybe doesn't know how to do that.
I think you are really onto something. When I talk about mental health now, I have to also talk about sense of belonging, family, connection, because the two are so inextricably linked. And using this factory settings idea again, it's if you look at the brain architecture and those modular bits, it's like you've got a whole lot of hardware that is there just to worry about what other people think of you, right? And to respond positively to affection and nurturing and closeness, right?
Yeah.
And to fear rejection. Anyone who's ever been a teenager knows this experience all too well.
Yep.
And that's, again, I don't want to be one of these people that points at the modern world and all the ways in which we've allowed it to work against our own well-being. But
then it sort of
it
does.
does.
Yeah. Like I think about, as a university student, right? Like your day is like, get up, maybe you go to the gym, but maybe you just go directly to class, right? Eat something, go to class, right? Go to your lectures, go to your labs, grab food when you can, and then go study, go work more in a lot of like sedentary positions where you're just sort of by yourself for the most part, or you're like, even if you're in a room, like a lecture hall with a lot of people, how much do you actually engage with the people around you? Not a lot. And then I notice, which is the most frustrating thing, is when you're like mental health, experts are right. Like, okay, I'm doing the thing that's comfy, hanging out by myself, doing my schoolwork, whatever. And then I'm like, oh, I'm sad.
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, well now I'm going to go socialize and be physically active and meditate. And then it's like, and now I feel better. And I hate that all of that work is right.
It's almost like people are paid to figure these things out for
You know what?
you.
You know what, Guy? I don't want to hear it.
It's almost like we have people who are hired to strategize these
Oh,
things.
yeah.
If
definitely.
only the people in charge listened to me more.
Good point.
You know what? Fair enough. I think we all have experienced that recently with some other
as a
things.
physics major.
Yeah.
Yep.
So you just said something that really I wanted to highlight again, and I'm talking slowly so that my brain can find it again. It's one of those moments where I had the train of the thought and then I got pushed off.
If I can just remind you, I think I had just talked about being frustrated that like mental health should actually work, right? Whereas if you just do the thing that is like kind of expected of you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. You reminded me.
Excellent.
So two things. I'll leave the second one, which is scary data. That'll be the second thing we'll talk about. But the first one will be things that work. So I taught a course last term. It's the first time this course was ever taught. The course title was Mental Health Literacy, and the course code was, I believe, the coolest course code that has ever been given to a course, because it was ARTS 2001.
Nice.
If you're an Arthur C. Clarke or Stanley Kubrick fan. And in this course, one of the things that we did was 2 different times the students had to try out a wellness strategy. So they had to pick from amongst mindfulness, journaling, physical exercise, or being in nature.
Yeah.
And try that out for 2 weeks and journal about it, do some reflection. And they did that, and then I'm going through, I'm grading, I'm reading the 65 submissions on that, and 98% of them had the same descriptions. One, I never would have done this if you hadn't made me,
Yes.
because you made it a part of the course.
Mm-hmm.
Two, I can't believe the benefit I got out of this.
Yeah.
I'm sleeping better. I'm less anxious. I have more
Yeah.
energy.
I
Yeah,
never
yeah.
would have done things to help my mental health, but now that you may do it,
Yes.
I am very appreciative
Yeah.
of it.
It's the being frustrated with your therapist because they're right.
Yep.
Like,
Oh,
just-
it so is.
Yeah.
I'm on a crusade to make this, that we will now create systems, offer courses where we're going to make you.
It would be so good. First year university where you might be living on your own for the first time and then just be like, hey, okay, now that you maybe have been removed, like for me when I came to university, I'm from Alberta. Like I came to UNB and my whole support system had basically vanished.
Yep.
And I had totally taken it for granted. I was like, okay, I don't have my parents. I don't have, my friends, my cadet officers. Like suddenly everybody is gone. And now I have to figure out what the heck to do with that.
And
Yeah,
it's
it'd be so good to have a course on that.
Those kinds of challenges have always existed, and they just could not be any more acute and pervasive. And this is when I talked about the scary data, because I'm in the process of writing a chapter for a book that's coming out, and I was tasked with talking about mental health and the first year experience. Now, this data I was already familiar with, but I did a deeper dive into it. And this is data that talks about all sorts of things related to mental health and well-being for youth, younger than university age, but also university aged in Canada. And it's really scary.
Yeah.
When I say really scary, I mean if you look at the rates of suicide for young girls in Canada, starting around 2009 to 2018, they tripled.
That's a big change.
It didn't
like-
it didn't for boys.
Wow. Cool.
And we have and then local data here for the UNB student population, and people just talking about how poor their well-being is, and they're feeling frequently like overwhelmed, and I just don't think we can ignore that anymore.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to sort of swing us back maybe to like game design, and I had been thinking about like the state of flow that you can get to within video games. And I'm wondering if you have any. I can do a little primer here that flow is the oh gosh, I just had a word for it. The state that you reach where you're not actively thinking about like, okay, I'm going to do this thing and it's going to have this outcome, or I want this outcome. Let me try one of these two things. It's just response to something. So they talk about musicians, high-level athletes, but other times people have reported it in video games, right? Where you're just totally immersed. So I'm just wondering why that, maybe mental health, but I think we should get back to kind of game design stuff.
Okay, so my good friend Mehehi Csikszentmihalyi,
What a good name.
the theorist who first talked about flow.
Oh,
and flow states, and then he was a part of this positive psychology movement with Martin Seligman, which basically said that, hey, we spend a lot of time talking about all the bad parts of the human experience in psychology. Why don't we start talking and studying the good parts? And so I mentioned this course I'm teaching tonight on well-being gaming. Course I taught last week was on flow.
oh,
And we look at ways that, you can try to create the conditions to put you into flow. And there's a couple of different things, but one of them, sort of that key one, is one that we've already discussed, which is the Goldilocks zone, right?
Yeah.
Which is, a task that's not too easy and not too hard.
Yeah, it's just challenging enough for your skill level.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other things go in it has to be something that like you value.
Yeah.
And when we talk about like things like schoolwork or mental health, and sometimes those can be things that you don't really feel like you want to work on.
Yeah.
And there's reasons for that, because sometimes it can be scary and uncomfortable. And so usually a really good way to set the stage there is through sort of a values clarification exercise. What do you actually care about?
Yeah.
Like, what to you is really, really important, and then how does what you're currently doing fit into that?
Right.
And so for a student, sometimes that can be helpful. It's like, yeah, I guess I don't really love this course, but this course is going to let me finish this degree and I really love finishing this degree.
Yeah.
And so being able to use video games that are inviting and fun and responsive to the individual, because we know that everyone, in terms of wherever they are, or they're going to be on really different places in their journey.
Yeah.
And that, and I mean that in so many different ways, what their current level of mental health challenges or symptoms are, but also how they see and understand them. And so I think, as I'm talking, I feel like I'm designing a game.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm designing a game, and it would have to use, responsiveness driven by AI, to borrow a buzzword, where you get to, like, someone gets to go into an environment, and the environment is very responsive to who they are and how they see the world.
Yeah.
Because you have to make bridges to where a person is presently.
Right.
All the ideas and, these are the things you can do to feel better aren't really going to matter if a person doesn't connect to them or value them.
You have to do your goal setting properly. Like, you've got to do the, like, okay, I'm here and I want to get there, so I have to set some interim stages, and then I have to, you've heard of, like, SMART goal setting.
That's it.
Yeah. They have to be, oh my goodness, okay, let me see if I remember this acronym. They have to be specific, measurable, achievable, results. No, it's either reasonable or results based, and then timely. Yeah.
And that's right. And so if you were someone who was designing a game, and I mean, this works whether you wanted it to build or be, supportive of their mental well-being or not. Yeah, you have to provide what's the next step.
Yeah.
For this person that feels like, oh, I want to do that because I see something that it leads towards that I'm attracted to, but also you've made the challenge, like, just right.
Like, what's the next narrative bit that's interesting to chase, or what's the next, like, achievement that I would like? Yeah.
And when I think of the games I played when I was younger, they were very text heavy.
Yeah.
Text heavy games, and you're reading, and so that's how you're engaging with those ideas and that world. And I think they spoke to us. And again, I'm talking, and I wonder, I'm interested, for younger people, but when I was like, I felt like I was an outsider. Because being a person who played video games at that age, you were. Yeah. So these games spoke, and they were, the people who made these games were older than I was at the time. But it's like, oh yeah, you've gone through this, where I am now, you once were. Yeah,
and they could be really accessible in that way of like, this is just an idea. You don't have to do anything with that, but just know that there's there was a really good thing that I read recently about a piece of poetry, or about sort of poetry broadly, of reading something that somebody else has experienced lets you know that somebody else has experienced something you're experiencing. So when you read something that you really relate to, I've had this moment a lot where I go, oh my goodness, somebody else has thought this before, right? And it's a really excellent feeling, even though it's words on a page or words on a screen, to just know that, like, hey, I'm not alone in feeling that.
So here's where we are, and this is so a game that is very much all about mental health. It's called Depression Quest.
Oh my goodness.
You can find this on the web to play, Depression Quest. And it was made by someone who had experienced really significant depression. And it's a text-based narrative game, and it starts off, and I'm pretty sure, if I'm remembering correctly, the character that you're guiding, your avatar, is a student. And so it starts off and it's like, you're at home, you're not feeling great, you've got a big paper you're supposed to be working on, right? So it goes through the narrative, and then it gives you your choices. What do you want to do? Right. Like, it's 2 or 3 choices. One of those choices is like, buckle down,
work on the paper,
do the work, but it's grayed out.
Oh, you can't do it.
And you can't do it.
Yeah.
And so then you pick the, like, oh, I binge Netflix or whatever. And then, the story continues. But then as you go through the story, you get choices like, do you go to therapy?
Yeah.
Do you start to try, being outside and getting some sun or exercise, see your friends? And so then as you do those things, at those options, like, do the schoolwork, start to open up for you.
Right.
And isn't that beautiful, where you can show someone that, like, oh my gosh, not only is someone else has felt like I feel now, but then you just illustrate how
There's a way out.
there's a way out.
Yeah.
Wait,
Yeah.
so this is the game that was designed by Zoe Quinn. Because
That-
I remember,
okay.
I remember hearing about Zoe Quinn for years, and I was trying to figure out what it was that she did, but I never thought about it long enough to start doing the Google search. But this was developed by Zoe Quinn, who was very popular in game journalism about 5 or 6 years ago.
And I know the name, but I did not connect that to depression. Okay.
Okay. Good
Okay.
connection.
That checks
okay.
out.
So, sorry, Depression Quest.
Depression Quest.
Excellent.
It is available on Steam for those listening who are interested. It's available on all major PC-style platforms, so Windows, Mac, Linux,
Cool.
as well as in the browser. I think that means it works on phone, theoretically. If
yeah.
you use Firefox, at least it will.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
cool.
Flash being a problem, but
Firefox with Flash built in now.
yes, you have converted me. I no longer use any other browser.
one should
It's
use Google Chrome.
Firefox everywhere.
Firefox is very good.
anyway.
I would like to jump in a little bit and also talk about
course,
other games
yeah.
that are really
Yeah.
good for mental health. We've talked a lot about games that are good at talking about mental health as a concept, but also games that are good for your mental health. I want to throw out a few examples of these. So one of my favorite games when it comes to games about mental health has been Celeste. I think everybody reasonably knows about Celeste if they listen to a video game design show. Admittedly, Celeste is a platformer game about a character, I think, named Madeline, who her goal is to summit a mountain that's believed to be near impossible to summit. But the entire game is actually about her dealing with her own anxieties and her own self-worth issues and even some of her own depression. And the game manifests that anxiety by making the levels harder temporarily, by making you be chased by a shadow version of yourself, which is a representation of her anxiety that happens very early on in the game and will continue throughout. The game really digs into this. Let's make the mental health a game design mechanic, and when the mental health gets worse, the game gets harder, like
Yeah.
measurably
Yeah.
harder. But another really good example of a game about mental health, coming all the way back to trauma from when I brought it up with Tetris, is Omori. Omori is a traditional JRPG featuring kind of two worlds, the real world and the dream world. But it's about a character who, to not spoil why, has undergone very significant levels of trauma, like objectively suffering from PTSD style.
Okay.
And the game is all about how that PTSD has affected their view of the world and their perceptions and their memories and what they value. It has a very nice colorful element of storytelling in its world building, that everything in the world is pastel and happy and like the dream world idea, except for the main character Omori, who is drawn only in black and white. No grays either. Perfectly black and white.
Yeah.
When every other character is pastel. I think both these are really good games for talking about mental health, though there's also the question of games that are good for you if you're suffering from mental health issues.
yeah.
Yeah.
I personally would say Stardew Valley is particularly useful for this.
Very relaxing.
Yeah.
It's a relax, but it also can be a very social game, and it helps deal with stuff like scheduling and long-term planning, which I think are all very beneficial. I've seen a lot of people talk about games like Minecraft being good for much the same reason.
Sure.
There's also this whole genre of games called walking simulators, which are
I've
disingenuous, but the idea being that these games are often the mental health games as well.
Yeah.
As you're doing a story-driven, world-driven adventure that's not quite pressuring. You're not fighting
Yeah.
monsters, you're not killing things, you're discovering through exploration. And this kind of does lead me into the other question I want to ask you, Matt, which we've about 15 minutes left, so we'll
Okay.
kind of use this as like the remainder of the episode, is how can we take these lessons from psychology, these lessons from mental health, and even these previous games to make better, healthier games? What do you think on this?
Yeah, and I think we've identified, two ways that games can help. One is the letting you know you're not alone, and then the other one is, learning skills or, a refuge. And if I think on that first one, the letting other people know that they're not alone, that means don't be afraid to put your dark stuff out there. And I'm someone who, I think because of how my inclination to be very open, but then also in my role as a, mental health educator at times, I talk about my experiences with mental health very openly to diverse groups, but especially students and young people, with this hope of letting them know primarily you're not alone.
Yeah.
Because, and you're talking about Omori, and I've never played the game, but I'm kind of familiar with it, and the fact that the character is black and white because right, that's how you feel.
So, yeah, it is.
I feel so different from
Yeah.
everyone else, and that's what stigma has done, right? When we have this stigma around mental health issues where we just don't talk about it,
Mm-hmm.
and then so consequently, we're so intimately familiar with all our own failings and worries,
Yeah.
but we don't know other people's.
Oh, yeah.
And so we just feel, dejected and alone. So I think, games should not be afraid to destigmatize mental health,
Yeah.
mental being by actually incorporating it as a main focus or as, or sort of a system within the game. In a Darkest Dungeon series, you've got your hit points, but you've also got your I forget what they were called, but
It was probably something like stress or something.
It was stress. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, stress is a cool system that comes up in some tabletop RPGs where, when you're attempting an ability check in D&D and you roll a D20 and it comes up with a 1, or you just don't pass the check, right?
Yep.
It's DC 15, you roll like a 5, right? Like you still failed the check even if you didn't,
That was why did you fail? It was easy.
Why did you fail? It was easy, right? You can have a token, right?
Ooh.
Which are stress tokens, and they occur in different ways, and people have started to use them in like D&D and other stuff. But the idea is you now have a way to trade in this thing that caused you stress, right? So you did fail. You don't get to do this thing, and and that has consequences. But the idea is you now get to learn from this stress, right?
Oh, that's so great.
You can take that. You can put it in your pocket, and later you can use it to. I think it differs, but some of it is if you attempt another check, you can have advantage, and you can trade in this token.
I'm focused now.
Yes, I tried that, and narratively you can do it in a thing of okay, my character remembers the last time I tried to kick a door and it didn't work. I'm gonna remember that and remember to really give it my all this time, or skill based.
I love
I
that.
broke my thieves' tools. So this time I'm going to be really careful.
There's nothing sadder than a thief whose thieves' tools have broken.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I love that from a game design perspective because it makes failing interesting, which some of the best games do.
Yeah.
But then again, it incorporates this idea that that's a real thing that would happen to you.
Yeah.
As
that's
a
a
human.
real thing that you can do.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like the idea of, I've never done this, but imagining something doesn't go right. You get a mark back on an assignment that you didn't really apply yourself on, and you go, okay, hang on, I need to maybe take a stress token on that one. Think about it, put it in my back pocket. Just next time one of these comes up, I need to remember what I did wrong.
No, and you just, so it's funny, you said I need to take a stress token on this, and then sometimes we can do that, and that can be useful because and this kind of goes to the second part of the question of what can games do, and it's to illustrate the sometimes ephemeral concepts that we associate with mental health, well-being, cognition, right? They can be really hard to understand, but games and systems can give you something to latch on and play with, and then now you start to understand yourself differently, and you have something to hold on to and to interface with.
I really like the word ephemeral there, right? Bringing something that is sometimes there, sometimes not, and then giving it a rigid system to exist within, so that when it is there, you can understand what to do with it, right? I think that's huge for games.
I think we've made a big mistake in or an oversight on our part. And when I say our part, I mean mental health educators, where we have made, I think, certain aspects of mental health or well-being too complicated when it didn't need to be.
Yeah.
And I think by doing that, by not considering that bridge that we've talked about before, how can we get people here, we've just sort of left people with this sense of okay, I think I know that's still important, but I'm not sure what to do.
Yeah.
But games can be, again, one of the big I think attractive features of games is we associate games with fun.
Yeah.
And at the very start of the show, when I was talking about the tabletop RPG and that, it's one of the reasons that was so effective is because you were playing a game and having fun. Wow, you didn't even realize you were learning.
Yeah.
And so, games being able to, take advantage of the research that we have now around, human functioning and emotion, and let's turn that into a game to teach people And now this is all I want to do.
Yeah.
I'm just like, I can't go back to work now without just being
no. You have to be thinking about this for the rest of time. Yeah, I think it's so valuable to take things that, you think about in an abstract way. And like people who don't have backgrounds in mental health, education, just going like, okay, well, these are all things that I've experienced and I know like my friends have thought about, but I don't know, what to do about that, particularly the idea of like, okay, well, what if I think about it as a game? Or what if I go play a game for a little bit and just see how I feel about that? Yeah, it's a really, really interesting way to do that. Start interacting with the things that you already like in a different way.
Oh, I'm very sparked by this conversation to do this.
Yeah, it's super cool. Gaia, I was just wondering about Persona 5. I was just thinking about whether or not you had some, because like I'm thinking about games that we spend lots of time in, right? Like I do the immersive RPG thing because that's something I really, really enjoy. Right, so like playing Baldur's Gate 3. I don't know if have you touched it?
No, I know.
Okay.
I know 1 and 2 very well.
Yes. Okay. 3 is very good.
Mm-hmm.
And lots of situations that I have put my character in because I'm playing as an avatar of myself, right? I didn't go build some other person, built myself. Going, how do I approach this, right? I have a system of values. How do I approach different types of conflict? And then seeing a consequence that I like, where I compromised for something else. Like there's a whole mechanic about like you can accept some, I'm just going to say sort of broadly darkness. You accept something to get more powerful. Mm-hmm. And, I didn't consciously do it as like a character decision. I just kind of went, no, I want to be more powerful. I'd like to hit harder, right? Okay, I'll do that. And then seeing it as a consequence to something I do value, I went, oh man, maybe I shouldn't have made that choice. But I got to exercise it in a game where it wasn't something huge. So I'm just curious, Guy, about, I haven't played Persona 5.
Persona 5 is interesting in this discussion, partially because it's not a game that uses psychology, and it's not a game about mental health. Mm-hmm. It is a game about psychology as a field of study. So the idea of Persona 5 is a game about Jungian psychology. This is true about the entire Persona series. It is more true now than it was originally. Persona 5, I think Persona 3 is when they went the deepest in Jungian psychology, where they talked about like Tartarus and issues like that within Jungian psychology. But the whole idea of Persona is that people who have big, major delusions of grandeur or dark thoughts have the mind palace, a concept from Jungian psychology that manifests their quote-unquote dark desires, and your goal is to take away the source of those dark desires. In Persona 5, that's called the treasure of the palace, but in other Persona games, it could be the leader of the palace. They don't even always call it the mind palace, but the various personas in the game do mirror the Jungian psychology of what a persona is, and the fact that you use these personas to deal with problems. Again, the entire game is Jungian psychology, the game. And we can talk about the validity of Jungian psychology in current year, but as an area for game design, it's incredibly interesting.
Sure.
It's one of those games that if you want to learn about psychology in a fun, interactive way, it really does provide that for you. And it does still have the in-depth, it does have a discussion of mental health to some degree, overcoming adversity, the really deep RPG elements that you were talking about, Vi. But it really is a game where what if we turned psychology itself into a game? And that's really the vibe that I get from the Persona
series. Which could be such a cool application of here's your mental health regime. Here's what you need to know. Here's the literacy about how to take care of yourself. The game. I was just thinking about how Persona 5 is more of a teaching game and less of an experiencing game, right? Whereas a lot of RPGs tend to be an experiencing game, right? Where you're putting yourself in the driver's seat and being like, okay, what do I think about that? What choice do I make here? Yeah.
That's an incredible, and I'm not joking that, as we're talking, I'm like, oh, I see some stuff we could do here.
Yeah.
I've already, years ago, I have so much less time now that since we have a child, but pre-child years used to run a board game club here on campus.
Oh.
Why did I run the board game club? Was it because I love board games? Yes, but also I knew there were so many people on campus who had that as an interest, but also didn't really have connection.
Yeah.
And so let's create this place. I remember when we did the marketing for it, we said, hey, don't be afraid to come alone.
Yeah.
There will always be someone to like greet you and like integrate you in the group, and that was my role.
Yeah.
And it worked so well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now that hasn't happened for a long time, but I'm like, well,
Maybe
let's
we
just
should
do
do that again.
I think the university does Thursday night collaborations with Comic Hunter downtown for board game and TTRPG nights.
Yeah, but isn't that hosted downtown though?
No.
No, it's hosted in Marshall Davery.
Marshall Davery.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, every Thursday. But yeah, with that kind of covers the overall questions we wanted to ask you,
Perfect.
Matt,
Yeah.
the overall topics. How can we use video games to help with mental, the more scientific side to just the, let's talk about Stardew Valley side, to
Yeah.
like psychology and neurology and games about psychology and games that use psychology. It really hits in on all these very complicated topics. So I want to thank you so much for coming in today.
Yeah.
If anybody was ever interested in reaching out to you in any way, do you have anything you would like to, any way they could contact you?
Oh my gosh, Google me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Google my name, Matthew MacLean, UNB, and you'll find me. And I do love to hear from people. I mean, I really think of myself as a servant of the community, and so people have ideas. I want to help make them happen.
Awesome.
So Matt, thank you so much for joining us today for having such
Yeah.
an in-depth
Thank you.
discussion.
And it sounds like we've given you some stuff to walk away thinking
Big
about,
time.
which is great.
And for
yeah.
all of you listening, thank you so much for listening today.
Hang
Yes.
on, sorry, guy, not to interrupt your
Outro.
outro. Thank you. If anyone's looking for mental health resources on campus, what's a good way to go about finding them?
Yeah, I mean, our website, the UNB Counseling Services website, will have everything you need, from like how to make an appointment at counseling services to what other stuff in the community you might be able to avail yourself of, or the whole panoply of online virtual resources. Because again, a lot of it is learning some ideas. That's the easy part. The hard part is putting them into practice. Maybe
Right.
that's more where counseling services comes in.
Yeah. Okay, awesome.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I've been Gaia,
I've been Vi.
and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
And that's it for today's episode. But what if you wanted to listen to more? Well, our new episodes come out every Thursday at 9 p.m. Atlantic, and there are 3 different ways that you can listen. If you're in the Fredericton area of New Brunswick, Canada, you can listen live on CHSR 97.9 FM through any of your radio services. If you're not in this region or you prefer using the internet, you can tune in on chsrfm.ca at the same time, 9 p.m. Atlantic. As well, we release all of our episodes on a number of podcasting platforms online, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. So if you wanted to, you could go back right now and listen to Season 1, where Vi and I do a deep dive into the fundamental concepts of game design, rather than the hardware they'll be taking up this season. Anyways, thank you for listening, and have a good one.